The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The air inside Corcoran State Prison always changes when a high-security escort moves through the hallway. Conversations stop. Boots slow down. Doors seem louder. Everyone feels it. That quiet pressure that only appears when the prison is moving someone whose name once shook the country. On this afternoon, the tension crawled across the tiers as a group of officers led a restrained inmate toward the restricted wing. No one said his name out loud, but every man behind those doors knew exactly who he was. Corcoran has held some of the most notorious criminals in American history: assassins, cult leaders, serial offenders, and men whose crimes filled headlines in the US, UK, and Canada for decades. Some are gone, but a few remain. The sound of chains echoed under the fluorescent lights. Someone whispered, "They still keep him here?" A second voice answered, almost afraid to be heard, "Not just him. There are 9 more like that." And for a moment, everyone stood still, because inside Corcoran, the past isn't something you read in old newspapers. It walks the same halls. It eats in the same units. It breathes behind the same steel doors. These are the men whose stories never left Corcoran. The ones whose cases shaped America's darkest chapters. And the ones who, even today, remain locked inside one of the most feared prisons in California. The list begins now. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The moment the escort team disappeared into the restricted wing, the rest of the prison seemed to settle back into its tense rhythm. But the weight of that movement stayed. Corcoran State Prison has always existed in a strange space between reality and legend, a place where the most notorious moments in California's correctional history never fully fade. Anyone who spends enough time inside those walls eventually learns that Corcoran is not remembered for its size or its location. It's remembered for the people who once lived here, the investigations that followed, and the impact those events left on American crime history. Long before that afternoon's high-security escort, the prison had already earned a reputation as one of the toughest facilities in the state. Built in 1988 during California's height of overcrowding and rising crime rates, Corcoran was designed to handle the most challenging inmates the system could produce. The state didn't just send anyone here. Corcoran became the destination for individuals whose cases had already dominated the national conversation. Men connected to assassinations, cult activities, organized crime structures, and long-standing serial investigations. The moment a bus turned off Highway 43 and led someone toward those massive gates, the outside world disappeared behind layers of concrete, razor wire, and history. Inside the facility, older staff often talked about the early years when the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, became the center of national attention. Investigators, journalists, and civil rights groups would all come pouring into the prison across the 1990s, trying to understand how a single institution could generate so many headlines. The SHU was built for inmates considered too dangerous, too high-profile, or too disruptive for general population. It was meant to be controlled, structured, predictable. Instead, it became a symbol of one of the most heavily scrutinized chapters in California's corrections system. Officers who were around during that era remembered the constant pressure. Some had escorted individuals so well known that their names had become part of American crime history. There were prisoners whose cases filled decades of debate, individuals whose crimes were studied in the US, UK, and Canada, and men whose trials left investigators sorting through evidence that shaped entire legal reforms. Many of those inmates were eventually moved, transferred, or placed into different facilities over time, but the shadows of those cases never left Corcoran. Their histories remained embedded in the structure of the prison, in old cells, in paperwork, in conversations that drifted quietly through the tiers. Younger officers heard those stories gradually. No one sat them down with a formal lecture. The information came in pieces: a comment during a shift, a name mentioned while passing through the rotunda, a small detail handed down by someone who had worked there decades earlier. The prison became a classroom, and its teachers were people who had lived through investigations, lawsuits, audits, and national news coverage. They described transport days when entire yards shut down, times when media vans were lined up outside the gates, and mornings when new administrative memos changed the rules for everybody. What struck most new staff wasn't just the names of the former inmates. It was the scale of the events that unfolded around them. Corcoran didn't simply house individuals. It became the stage for some of the most controversial moments in the state's correctional system. Congressional hearings were held because of what happened here. State and federal investigators spent years combing through old reports and officer statements. Advocates demanded reforms. Politicians publicly debated the prison in televised sessions. For a period of time, Corcoran wasn't just another maximum security facility. It was the center of a national conversation on power, oversight, and responsibility. The inmates connected to those events, the ones whose presence shaped policy and public perception, became part of the institution's lasting identity. Many were moved on to other facilities, but a few stayed longer. Their histories remained here, attached to the place like a second skin. When officers walked through the SHU, they passed cell doors that once held individuals whose cases were studied in criminology courses. When they crossed the main yard, they stepped on ground where some of the most high-profile inmates in California once lived, exercised, argued, prayed, and waited out their sentences. There was a strange quietness about these remnants. Corcoran didn't display plaques. There were no guided tours or marked hallways pointing out where certain individuals were once housed. Instead, the history clung to the building through memory and experience. A certain cell had once been home to a nationally recognized figure. A certain walkway had once been shut down for days because of a high-risk movement. Certain names, when spoken, still triggered an instinctive tension in correctional staff, even long after those men had been relocated or had passed away. But Corcoran's legacy didn't come only from individual inmates. It came from the atmosphere that surrounded them. The prison operated in a world where security levels shifted constantly, where danger lived around every corner, and where officers were trained to expect the unexpected. In a place with such a volatile history, the stories of former inmates never felt distant. They felt present, alive, and heavy in the air. No one had to explain that. The walls carried the memory on their own. On that particular day, the same day when whispers spread about who was being escorted through the restricted wing, the weight of that history felt unusually close. Even inmates who rarely reacted to anything seemed to pause, leaning toward their bars with the quiet curiosity of men who had heard 100 rumors but learned to trust only the tension they felt in the room. When a prison has held some of the most well-known offenders in American criminal history, the arrival or movement of a high-profile figure sends a ripple through the entire facility, whether that figure is new or simply returning from a medical unit or legal appointment. That ripple was moving again now. Men who had lived inside Corcoran for years understood exactly what it meant. The prison may change. Policies may shift. Officers come and go. But the legacy of the facility, the infamous names tied to it, the events that put it in the spotlight, never truly leaves. Stories get passed down in the dining hall, in the exercise cages, in the quiet hours before lights out. They become part of the prison's DNA. And as those chains echoed deeper into the restricted wing, a quiet truth settled across the unit. Some histories are too large to disappear. Some reputations never fade. And in Corcoran State Prison, the ghosts of the past still walk the same hallways. The tension held the moment like a breath. Something was about to surface, a connection to one of those notorious chapters, and the entire unit felt it tightening around them. The next movement of the escort would reveal who had returned and why. The heavy door to the restricted wing closed behind the escort team, and for a moment, the sound hung in the air like a slow-rolling echo. Inside the main unit, men leaned back from their bars, trading quiet looks. The transfer was over, but the question remained suspended. Who had come back to Corcoran now? The prison had seen many names, some nationally known, some tied to cases that still appeared in documentaries across the US, UK, and Canada. And when a figure like that moved inside the facility, the entire building reacted. Down in the administrative wing, the day had begun like any other. Officers processed paperwork, supervisors checked staffing rosters, and counselors reviewed scheduling for inmate programs. But everything shifted when a thick folder stamped, high profile, restricted, was delivered to the associate warden's office. It was the kind of folder that only appeared when an inmate with an unusually complicated history was being reassigned. The warden flipped it open, scanned the first page, and immediately slid it back across the desk. "So he's back," he said quietly. Word didn't move through the administration the way it did through the units. There were no whispers, no speculative looks, no quiet huddles beside the bars. In the office spaces, the change came through tightened shoulders, quicker steps, and the silent understanding that the coming weeks were about to become heavier. When a high-profile inmate re-entered Corcoran, protocols expanded. Staffing adjusted. Supervision levels elevated. Everything tightened. The officers chosen for the escort knew the details. They had read enough about the inmates' past assignments, transfers, and medical placements to understand why the security level needed to rise. But most of the prison didn't get those details. All they saw was the chain of officers surrounding a figure whose identity carried weight. All they heard was the buzz of radios, the clipped commands, the metallic rattle of restraints. And in a place where history is a living thing, that was enough to ignite the rumors. In the SHU, men paced inside their cells, listening to the distant movements. Some had been in Corcoran long enough to remember other moments like this. They remembered when the facility held infamous names, figures tied to high-profile assassinations, organized crime networks, serial investigations, and cases that dominated newspapers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some of those men had passed away. Others had been transferred. Some had spent their final years under medical supervision. But the memory of their presence stayed fixed inside the walls. Inmate Ramos, whose cell faced the walkway leading toward the restricted corridor, leaned against his bars and watched the tail end of the escort. He couldn't see the inmate at the center, only the protective formation around him. But that was enough. A high-risk return, he muttered to himself. Has to be someone from the old days. Across the tier, another man called out. The ones from the old days don't come back. Ramos shook his head. You'd be surprised. The tension wasn't about fear. It was about curiosity. Corcoran rarely moved someone into the restricted wing without reason. The men who ended up there had long histories connected to cases that had shaped California law enforcement for decades. They weren't random transfers. They were individuals whose cases were studied by criminology students in the U.S. and analyzed in crime documentaries overseas. The escort team reached the inner gate of the restricted area. Inside that hallway, cameras lined the ceiling every few feet. Officers stood at fixed posts behind reinforced glass. Movements in and out of this wing required multiple electronic clearances and administrative authorization. It wasn't a place inmates just walked into. It was reserved for the highest levels of supervision. Individuals considered too vulnerable, too notorious, or too historically impactful to mix with the general population. Inside that secure hallway, the inmate at the center of the escort raised his head just enough to look down the corridor. His beard had grayed over the years, and deep lines cut across his face like neglected roads. Tattoo ink curled up his neck, faded by age and time. His hands were cuffed at the waist, but his eyes were steady, calm, almost resigned. He had been here before. He knew this prison better than most. The officers guiding him didn't speak. They didn't need to. The man knew exactly where he was going. Meanwhile, outside the restricted wing, unit officers tried to maintain the routine. Yard movement continued. Meal distribution carried on. Programs resumed. But everything felt slightly off rhythm. It was as if the prison was waiting for confirmation about who had returned. The inmates sensed it. The staff felt it. Even the silence in certain corridors felt heavier. In the dining hall, conversations murmured quietly beneath the clatter of trays. A group of older inmates sat together, exchanging slow nods. One of them, a man named Wilkes, tapped his fork on the table. If they're putting someone back in that wing, he said softly, it's someone the outside world hasn't forgotten. Another replied, if the outside world remembers, so does this place. Back in administration, the associate warden reviewed the movement orders again. The inmate's case file was thick, filled with decades of documentation, court notes, psychiatric evaluations, and placement reviews. His history had crossed multiple institutions. His name had surfaced in several public hearings during the years when Corcoran faced its hardest scrutiny. He was connected to moments that still appeared in news archives and academic discussions, events that reshaped how California handled maximum security custody. The warden walked in and stopped behind the associate's desk. "We need to keep this quiet," he said. "No details outside the necessary staff." "It won't matter," the associate replied. "The inmates will piece it together. The staff will too. They'll guess," the warden said. "But they won't know for sure." Even he knew the truth behind those words. In a place like Corcoran, secrets were temporary. Back inside the restricted wing, the inmate was escorted into a holding area. Officers removed the waist chain, replaced it with a short tether, and stepped back as the door closed. The man took a slow breath. The room felt smaller than he remembered. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Time seemed to press against him from all directions. A guard outside the holding cell glanced at him through the narrow window. The inmate didn't look threatening. Age had softened the edges, worn down the sharpness. But history wasn't something that faded with age, and his history was heavy. He lowered himself onto the bench and rested his hands on his knees. For years, he had been moved from one institution to another, sometimes for medical care, sometimes for security reassessment. But Corcoran had always been the place most connected to his past. Returning here felt like stepping back into a chapter that had never fully closed. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Outside, the officers waited for the next instruction. The prison waited for the next rumor. And across the units, inmates waited for the next whisper of confirmation. The question now wasn't just about who had returned. It was about what his return meant. Because in Corcoran State Prison, no one comes back without a reason. And this reason was about to surface. Corcoran State Prison is one of the harshest correctional environments in California, but the real power inside those walls is not defined by concrete, steel, or the authority of the state. It is defined by people, by their influence, their history, their alliances, and the unspoken codes they've learned to navigate over years of incarceration. The most brutal inmates still locked inside Corcoran understand this reality better than anyone. They know that inside this prison, survival is not just physical. It is a political game with rules that outsiders rarely see and inmates never forget. Every correctional facility has an official structure. Officers enforcing regulations, counts, schedules, and the physical design of the buildings. But beneath that visible layer is another structure, one that cannot be found in any prison handbook. It is the system created by inmates themselves, the invisible network of respect, fear, alliances, and unwritten rules that quietly dictate who can speak to whom, who can sit where, who can move freely, and who must always look over their shoulder. The individuals featured in this documentary have carved out a space within that structure, shaping it, bending it, and sometimes controlling it in ways even staff acknowledge privately. Inside Corcoran, everything is political. A simple walk from one building to another can be tied to a series of decisions made behind the scenes. Sitting at a certain table in the day room is never a random choice. It is a declaration of status. The inmates known for brutality often sit at the front positions that only those with power are allowed to occupy. Their placement is never questioned because their history has already spoken for them. Their names carry weight that many inmates have absorbed long before ever meeting them. Movement inside the prison is also deeply political. The institution sets a schedule, but inmates themselves decide who can safely move where. Some individuals are unofficially barred from specific yards because their presence could create tension. Others avoid certain walkways based on past conflicts or affiliations. Yet the most influential inmates, the ones whose reputations dominate the prison, have a level of freedom that is rare. They move with confidence not because they are escorted by staff, but because the entire population understands that their space and their safety is supported by a network of people who stand behind them. What most outsiders never understand is how fast information travels inside a place like Corcoran. With limited technology, one might assume communication is slow or restricted, but the opposite is true. Messages move with surprising speed through handwritten notes, quick conversations during meals, or subtle exchanges on the yard. A single sentence whispered to the right person can move from one building to another long before staff even suspect anything is happening. Some of the men in this story sit at the center of these informal communication webs. They don't need to speak loudly or frequently. The network maintains itself because inmates know the importance of staying connected. Information is power, and in a prison environment, knowing what will happen before it happens can be the difference between safety and chaos. The inmates with the most influence often learn about changes, tensions, or upcoming issues before nearly everyone else, and that insider knowledge reinforces their reputation. Their ability to predict situations, read people, and understand the emotional temperature of the yard gives them an advantage that goes far beyond physical strength. Reputation is perhaps the greatest currency inside Corcoran. Some inmates arrive already known statewide. Others build their reputation through years of incarceration, through their involvement in past events, or through leadership within certain groups. Regardless of how it began, the reputation of the men in this documentary has followed them across cell blocks, across prisons, and even across decades. Their names carry stories that circulate from inmate to inmate, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes exact, but always powerful. Even those who have never interacted with them directly adjust their behavior based on what they've heard. What makes reputation so valuable is that it can protect someone without them ever needing to show aggression. Many of the most brutal inmates do not rely on threats or intimidation to maintain influence. They don't need to. Their past actions, their strategic decisions, and their long-standing presence inside the system speak for them. Other inmates recognize their authority instinctively, without any display of force. Respect, fear, caution, these emotions follow them into every room they enter. But the most striking element of their power is psychological. Physical dominance might help someone survive in the early stages of incarceration, but long-term influence comes from strategic thinking and emotional control. Many of these men possess an almost unsettling calmness. They observe more than they speak. They react slowly, deliberately, and with full awareness of the consequences. They understand the rhythm of prison life in a way that only decades of experience can teach. Their ability to stay composed when others panic sets them apart. It gives them leverage in negotiations, in conflicts, and in the general unpredictability of daily life inside Corcoran. This psychological strength also plays a major role in forming alliances. Corcoran is built on a network of groups, affiliations, personal loyalties, and long-standing internal hierarchies. The brutal inmates featured in this documentary often have circles of people who respect them, not out of fear, but out of trust. These alliances are not built overnight. They are cultivated through years of consistent behavior, through leadership during crises, and through strategic thinking that benefits not just themselves, but the people around them. Their influence extends far beyond their immediate cell. It spreads across yards, across work assignments, across buildings, and sometimes into other prisons entirely. Within these alliances, responsibilities are distributed quietly but effectively. Some inmates take on roles as communicators. Some handle negotiations. Others ensure the smooth functioning of daily routines within their group. The central figure rarely needs to oversee every detail. Instead, they set a tone and an expectation that their supporters follow. Their leadership is felt rather than loudly expressed. Ultimately, the politics of survival inside Corcoran State Prison revolve around understanding people, their fears, their goals, their loyalties, and their histories. The most brutal inmates still locked inside the facility have mastered this understanding. They know how to move without appearing to. They know how to influence without forcing. They know how to maintain order within their circles without drawing unnecessary attention. Their power is not just physical. It is psychological, social, and deeply rooted in the invisible systems that govern prison life. Corcoran is a place where a single decision can echo for months, and where a single mistake can change a man's standing overnight. The inmates at the center of this documentary have survived not just through intimidation, but through strategy, through presence, through a level of awareness that makes them more than just prisoners. It makes them political figures within one of the most controlled environments in America. Inside Corcoran State Prison, the yard is more than a place to exercise. It is a microcosm of the prison itself, a living, breathing arena where history, reputation, and influence collide. For the most brutal inmates still locked inside, the yard is both stage and battlefield, a place where dominance is asserted without the need for official enforcement, and where alliances are constantly tested by the unspoken rules that govern life behind the walls. Every movement across the yard is observed. Every glance can carry meaning. The men who have survived decades in Corcoran understand this instinctively. They know which conversations are safe, which faces indicate respect, and which shifts in posture signal a potential threat. For them, walking across the open concrete is like navigating a chessboard, where each step must be measured, calculated, and deliberate. The yard is divided not just by fences and gates, but by respect and reputation. Certain corners, benches, and tables are claimed without a word spoken. The most influential inmates occupy these areas, and others avoid them. An empty space in the center of a bench row does not necessarily signal opportunity. It is often a sign that someone is too powerful to challenge. For newcomers and those without history in the prison, these boundaries can be confusing, even intimidating. For the men at the top of Corcoran's unspoken hierarchy, however, these same boundaries serve as markers of authority, invisible signs that communicate power without a single word. Inmates who have spent years in this environment describe the yard almost like a social contract. Every action carries consequences, every gesture conveys information, and every interaction reinforces the complex system of alliances and respect. A man who ignores these rules too often risks isolation, confrontation, or worse. The most brutal inmates know this, and they use it to maintain control. They do not have to enforce dominance through aggression alone. They enforce it through awareness, calculation, and strategic presence. Their ability to read the yard and respond appropriately is one of the key factors that has allowed them to remain influential for decades. Even the correctional officers recognize these dynamics, though they cannot always interfere. While official policies dictate how inmates should be managed, the reality is that the yard operates on two levels simultaneously: the visible, regulated level enforced by the state, and the invisible, inmate-driven level where reputation and history dictate behavior. Officers who have worked at Corcoran for years often acknowledge that certain inmates can move with confidence, their presence commanding attention not because of staff authority, but because of the quiet, consistent respect they have earned within the population. The most influential men have learned to blend these two systems seamlessly. They understand the boundaries imposed by staff and the limits of their own influence. They position themselves in ways that maximize safety while maintaining visibility. They communicate silently through gestures, subtle eye contact, and established routines, ensuring that their allies understand the intended message and that potential rivals are aware of the unspoken lines that should not be crossed. For the men at the top, alliances are critical. These are not casual friendships, but carefully constructed networks built over years of shared experiences, mutual benefits, and trust earned through consistency. Some alliances are formed along long-standing affiliations, others based on necessity, and still others formed through mentorship and strategic guidance. The most brutal inmates maintain small, loyal circles that act on their behalf, extending their influence beyond immediate proximity. Through these networks, they are able to monitor the yard, anticipate conflicts, and maintain dominance with minimal direct involvement. Psychological strategy plays a significant role in these interactions. A subtle shift in posture, a nod, or a glance can communicate volumes. Inmates who master this form of communication are able to manage tensions before they escalate. They can defuse potential confrontations, signal warnings, or redirect attention without a single raised voice. The yard becomes a theater where influence is demonstrated not through violence, but through perception, control, and anticipation. Even the smallest interactions carry weight. A casual conversation in the shade, a brief acknowledgement from across the yard, or the placement of a water bottle in a certain spot can all have meaning. Observing these interactions requires skill, awareness, and experience, and the men who dominate Corcoran have honed these abilities over decades. Their ability to predict behavior, interpret subtle signals, and adjust their own actions accordingly gives them an almost invisible form of power, one that is as effective as it is unnoticeable to the untrained eye. Despite the outward calm that sometimes blankets the yard, tension is always present. It is a subtle, constant energy that keeps everyone alert. The most brutal inmates have learned to navigate this tension like a second skin. They move with purpose but never recklessness, assert authority without provocation, and maintain a presence that is both commanding and controlled. Others recognize it instinctively, either respecting it or avoiding it. In many ways, this is the ultimate expression of survival, the ability to maintain influence while remaining untouchable, both physically and socially. For inmates who lack this experience or understanding, the yard can be perilous. Missteps can result in isolation, challenges, or sudden shifts in status. For those at the top, however, the yard is a domain where their history, strategy, and presence converge to create a level of security and dominance that few can contest. The reputation they have built over years serves as both armor and leverage, protecting them while reinforcing their influence. In this environment, power is not simply about what one has done in the past. It is about how effectively that history is wielded in the present. On the day the high-profile inmate returned to Corcoran, the yard felt the shift immediately. The whispers began, subtle at first, spreading from cell block to cell block, from exercise area to recreation yard. Inmates watched the gates, observed movements, and measured each other with a new attentiveness. Those who had been around during previous high-profile arrivals recognized the signs. They understood the subtle ripple that moves through a prison when a figure with history and reputation enters the space once more. Even without seeing him, the yard knew. The energy shifted, patterns adjusted, and unspoken boundaries were reinforced. The rules of the yard are ancient, unwritten, and enduring. They are the invisible code that determines respect, hierarchy, and survival. The men on this list have mastered those rules, and through that mastery, they have maintained their influence for years, even decades. They have survived not only the challenges of incarceration, but the constant scrutiny of staff, the unpredictability of fellow inmates, and the weight of their own histories. Corcoran is a place that tests every individual, and the most brutal inmates thrive precisely because they understand the dynamics that govern life beyond the official regulations. Walking through the yard is never simple, never neutral. For those who understand the code, it is a space of calculated movement, strategic observation, and deliberate interaction. For outsiders, it might look like a place to exercise or socialize. For the men who dominate it, the yard is a stage, a chessboard, and a proving ground. Each step matters, each glance has meaning, and every decision can reinforce or erode power. And as the sun dips lower over Corcoran on that return day, the yard is alive with silent awareness. The men at the top are watching, the networks are moving, and the invisible hierarchy has realigned itself once more. History is not past here. It is present, influencing every interaction, every glance, and every decision. In Corcoran, the yard is more than a place. It is the heartbeat of the prison, and the men who understand its rhythms are the ones who survive and endure. By the time night falls over Corcoran State Prison, the shadows stretch long across the tiers, and the hum of fluorescent lights fills the hallways. Inside these walls, history isn't just remembered, it lives. The most brutal inmates still locked inside move with a quiet authority that comes not from fear alone, but from decades of survival, strategy, and understanding the complex rules of this institution. Their presence is a reminder to everyone inside that Corcoran does not simply house criminals. It houses histories, reputations, and legacies that cannot be erased. The corridors are empty now, except for the sound of boots echoing off concrete floors, the occasional clatter of keys, and the distant murmur of inmates returning to their cells. Some walk slowly, aware that every step is being watched. Others move with practiced ease, carrying themselves in a way that quietly asserts authority. To anyone observing without context, these may seem like ordinary movements. But within the prison's walls, they are carefully orchestrated actions, part of a silent language of power that the most experienced inmates understand instinctively. In the restricted wing, high-profile inmates settle into their cells, the day's tension finally giving way to routine. But routine here is different from any ordinary prison. For the men who have survived decades in Corcoran, each moment is measured, calculated, and observed. They know that the prison is not just a place to serve time. It is a living environment where reputation, alliances, and strategy shape every interaction. Those who have mastered this environment carry influence far beyond their immediate surroundings. Their names resonate throughout the facility, whispered in confidence or noted with respect. Their histories remain tangible, and even as they sit behind steel doors, they continue to affect the balance of power within the prison. The legacy of these men is not only in their actions, but in the stories they leave behind. Officers, newer inmates, and even staff who have long since retired carry these stories forward. Tales of calculated moves, quiet authority, and the ability to maintain influence without confrontation are passed down like lessons in survival. Each man on this list represents a chapter of Corcoran's history that continues to influence life inside the walls. They are reminders of why this prison has remained one of the most feared, respected, and closely studied institutions in the United States. Yet despite the authority they wield, these inmates are also reminders of the system itself, the rules, policies, and oversight designed to contain them. Corcoran is not simply a stage for reputation. It is a controlled environment where even the most influential cannot act without limits. Every movement is monitored, every interaction recorded, and every procedure strictly enforced. Their power is significant, but it exists within the boundaries of an institution designed to test endurance, strategy, and patience over decades. Across the prison, the influence of these men can be felt in subtle ways. The allocation of space, the flow of conversation, the order in which inmates walk or sit, all reflect an underlying system of respect that has been built over time. Newer inmates quickly learn the invisible rules of the yard, of the dayroom, and of the corridors. They see the authority in the calm movements of a man whose past is legendary, and they adjust accordingly. They learn that survival is not only about physical strength, but about reading situations, understanding networks, and respecting those who have already endured years of Corcoran's unique pressures. Even staff recognize the weight of this legacy. While their role is to enforce the rules of the state, they also acknowledge the invisible hierarchies and the reputations that have been earned over decades. Experienced officers know which inmates carry influence beyond their cells, and which names evoke caution or respect in quiet conversations. They understand that the prison is not only a controlled facility, but also a complex ecosystem where history, reputation, and alliances create an additional layer of order and influence. As the night deepens, the prison quiets further. The hum of security systems becomes the only sound in some wings. Lights flicker over the yards, casting long shadows over empty concrete. Inside their cells, the most brutal inmates remain vigilant, aware that influence is maintained not only by past deeds, but by continued presence and strategic thought. They know that the power they hold is fragile and must be constantly reaffirmed, even if the world outside their walls is unaware of it. This is what makes Corcoran unique. It is a place where history is alive, where reputations are tangible, and where survival depends as much on intelligence and strategy as on any physical ability. The most brutal inmates are not simply remembered for the crimes that brought them here. They are remembered for the ways they have navigated decades of complex social and institutional pressures. Their legacy is embedded in every tier, in every corridor, and in every interaction that shapes life inside the prison. In the quiet of the night, the legacy of Corcoran's most infamous residents becomes clear. They are the men who have survived decades behind locked doors, who have adapted to an environment designed to test their limits, and who continue to influence the lives of everyone around them. Their presence is a living reminder of the prison's history, the strategies required to survive, and the unspoken rules that govern even the most brutal of environments. Corcoran State Prison does not exist merely as a structure of steel and concrete. It exists as a living entity shaped by the people within it. And the most brutal inmates still locked inside are a central part of that entity. They are figures whose histories, strategies, and influence have become inseparable from the very identity of the prison itself. Their stories are a testament to the complexities of life behind bars, to the endurance required to survive, and to the power that can exist quietly, invisibly, yet unmistakably, in the controlled chaos of one of America's most notorious prisons. As the night closes over Corcoran, the echoes of past and present converge. The names, the reputations, the histories, and the quiet authority of the most brutal inmates continue to reverberate through the halls. The doors remain locked, but the stories do not stop. Corcoran holds more than prisoners. It holds legacies that remain alive, shaping every moment, every interaction, and every life inside its walls. And in that silence, one truth is undeniable. These men may be confined physically, but their influence and their stories are free, extending far beyond the locked doors that hold them. For the outside world, Corcoran might appear as just another prison. But for those who live, work, and survive within it, it is a living history, a complex ecosystem of strategy, alliances, and influence. And the most brutal inmates still locked inside are its enduring heartbeat. Corcoran State Prison is more than a correctional facility. It is a place where reputations are forged, strategies are perfected, and legacies endure long after headlines fade. The most brutal inmates still locked inside are not just names on a list. They are living symbols of survival, influence, and the unspoken rules that govern life behind the walls. They remind us that history, even in the most controlled environments, continues to live, breathe, and shape the world around it. As we leave Corcoran for now, one thing remains clear. The shadows of the past are never truly gone, and the stories of those who have survived here will continue to echo through the halls of one of California's most notorious prisons. Hashtag Corcoran, hashtag most brutal, hashtag true crime, hashtag Golden State Killer, hashtag death row. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.